Well, thank you all for coming uh, on what seems to be a rainy Thursday afternoon to hear about our project. So just a few notes of housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, which is a little bit different. And so if you have a question to ask, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can, there's a way to raise your hand. If you look in the participant list or somewhere in your Zoom menu is a raise hand option. Um, and also you can bring up the chat window and you can ask us questions by chat. If you raise your hand, then then I'll enable your talking and we can answer your questions. There's also a question and answer box. So there's a number of ways that you can get in touch with us, and we'll be stopping for questions in a couple of places throughout the presentation. But that's how that all works. So yep, thanks again for joining us. The project is called Developing Conservation Plans for Long Island Sound Marsh Complexes. And I want to start with a necessary disclaimer here. Just that this project was funded with EPA and NEIWPCC and in partnership with Long Island Sound Study, but it hasn't undergone EPA peer review. So it's Long Island Sound Study, NEIWPCC, and EPA doesn't necessarily endorse these findings. So I'm going to start out just by talking briefly about the project, where we've gone and where we're going with it. We're going to spend some time. The primary goal here is to talk about the document that we produced. You should have received a copy unless you registered just prior to this meeting, in which case we'll send you out a copy of it afterwards. And I'll spend a little bit of time just looking at the Marsh-Fate Interactive Viewer, which is another part of this project. And the purpose of this project is well, there's a little bit of background here first that I'll provide, which is that NYSERDA, over about the last decade, this is the second of two projects, produced a number of sea level rise models along with my company, which is Warren Pinnacle Consulting. And this is the second project website, and there's a tremendous amount of information here because basically it's a model of marsh fate across coastal New York State on a 10-meter, actually a 5-meter basis, 5-meter cell size, and there's project reports, publications, video abstracts, video presentations, a ton of information here, but it's not particularly user friendly. And a lot of really at the heart of this are these GIS results, which required some GIS expertise to look at. They're available, and I'll show you how to get to them. So people that do have a moderate degree of GIS results can really can dig deep. But for most people who are making these choices, trying to go in and find the layer that they need and project it in the way that they need to project it, was a bit too much. And so this is where Vicky and NEIWPCC came in, recognizing the need to try to disseminate some of this information. So the first step was to take these results and look at 20 of the largest marsh systems in coastal Long Island and produce an online GIS viewer. And the goal here was to really make something that was lightweight, that was fast. Sometimes online GIS can be bulky. It's user-friendly. So we went through a number of user tests with that. And we actually had some webinars, 4 of them throughout coastal Long Island, where we presented that viewer and the results of our data analysis. And actually those results, they're all on YouTube if those meetings are. So I can show you how to get to those if you're interested in looking at those. The next step, however, was to try to go a little bit further. One of the pieces that this lightweight viewer has is it has tax parcels on it. Just try to get a sense of ownership and where you might be able to act and where you'd have more difficulty acting. And so to actually develop some marsh conservation plans and working with municipality, marsh conservation stakeholder groups in order to try to pull together people that are looking at these results and communicating together about how marsh conservation plans might come together. And that brings us to where we are now, really towards the very end of this project, where we're participating in this community workshop to roll out the conservation plans, but also to get feedback on how they're on what needs to be fixed or revised in that. And then we'll revise those results over the next month based on the community feedback. And I do want to acknowledge our wonderful stakeholder group who was really involved in this process. We've been working on this document, putting it together over the last 3 or 4 months. And we had really a nice group here from state departments, private associations, Hen Island Association, and New York State DEC, EPA, Save the Sound. Westchester County was very much involved, and Westchester Land Trust. So I appreciate all the help that they had in providing material and advice in terms of how to put this together. In terms of the project itself, the project leader is Vicki O'Neill, and I'll give her a moment to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Vicki O'Neill. I am the Long Island Sound Study Habitat Restoration and Stewardship Coordinator. I'm located at New York State DC office in East Setauket on Long Island, and I work for NEIWPCC.
Thanks. And I'm Jonathan Clow. I'm the founder of Warren Pinnacle Consulting, which is a extremely tiny consulting company out of central Vermont. And my colleague up till very recently was Dr. Marco Propato, who really helped us with these, the first part of this project, and also producing all these simulations. And okay, so now the document itself, as I said, you should have gotten a copy of this. If you didn't, there is a tiny URL that you can type in, and we'll be sending everybody who registered for this webinar, we'll be sending them the information again, just for the public comment. And our timeline is to give you a couple of weeks to look at it, digest it, see if you have anything that you want to say. And we will take into account all the public comments that we get and revise the document or provide feedback or respond to everybody who communicates with us. And so those comments, our timeline is to have those due in a couple of weeks, which would put us at April 30th. Can't believe it's almost May. But I guess, a couple of weeks, it goes by in a flash. Blink your eyes and they'll be gone. So in terms of the document itself, we worked with the group and came up with an outline. It's fairly straightforward, linear in nature, where we start by just talking about some of the existing marsh resources of Westchester County. And we couldn't be exhaustive, but we picked 6 of the largest coastal salt marshes in Westchester County on the Long Island Sound side. And we talk a little bit about the status and history of those marshes. Then we spend a little bit of time, why are we focusing on marshes here? Because they provide a lot of benefits, both to ecology and to humans. And they are under quite a number of threats. So we spend a little bit of time discussing those. And then we examine some of the options for marsh conservation planning. And this project is, I think we originally were anticipating sort of looking at a single marsh and talking about very specific options for marsh conservation, but our stakeholders really had a interest in more of a breadth kind of report. And so some of these discussion of the marsh conservation planning options are more broad, as opposed to saying, we need to purchase that parcel or do an easement on that parcel, but it gives some of the outline of the options and the resources that are available to local governments and stakeholders. And these, working with the stakeholders, again, these were the 6 marsh systems that we defined that are in the report. Blind-Brook Wetlands. So we're going to kind of work north to south in terms of whenever we look at results or anything. So Blind-Brook Wetlands, Marshlands Conservancy, Hen Island. I mean, Otter Creek might be first. They're kind of north to south. I think Otter Creek is first. Hommocks Conservation Area and Pine-Brook Wetland. So the Blind-Brook Wetlands is the furthest north. It's in the city of Rye. adjacent to Disbro Park, and there are 20 acres of irregularly flooded marsh habitat. And I meant to mention that this is one term that I'm going to be using, we're going to be looking at maps of to a certain extent, is this concept of an irregularly flooded marsh and a regularly flooded marsh. Those terms are taken from the National Wetland Inventory, but basically the concept is that an irregularly flooded marsh, based on its elevation or its geography, gets flooded less frequently. So less often than once per day with salt water. So it's a higher marsh, usually in elevation, has usually more of a brackish than a full salt marsh. And a regularly flooded marsh, something that gets flooded on an average day with average tides that will be underwater for the most part, and it will be a more saline marsh. And they produce slightly different benefits and have different characteristics. That's why, and they also have different degrees of resilience to sea level rise, which is part of the reason why we've broken them out this way. Moving on to Marshlands Conservancy, which if you are familiar with wetlands in Westchester County, you're very much likely to be familiar with Marshlands Conservancy because it's a very large wildlife sanctuary in the city of Rye. And it is it's designated as a significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat by New York State, and is also a Long Island Sound Study stewardship area. I see a mistake. I should have put a capital I on island. Otter Creek Preserve is next. It just slightly beating out Hen Island in the north to south race, located in Mamaroneck. And this is an interesting one because it is predominantly privately owned and protected by the Westchester Land Trust, and it's the largest privately owned wetland that's designated as a nature sanctuary in Westchester County. Then Hen Island is another privately owned island, but it's certainly publicly facing, and gets there are 26 acres of marshlands on Hen Island. And Hommocks Conservation Area, which is in Mamaroneck, and it's adjacent to, you can see a number of recreational opportunities that it's adjacent to. And there's about 3.6 acres of tidal wetlands, along with some woodland and meadow areas that's part of the Hommocks Conservation Area. And further south is the Pinnacle wetland, which is part of the Premium River Conservation Area Complex, a critical environmental area under the Environmental Quality Review Act, and there's 8 acres of tidal wetlands there. So that's kind of the setting that the primary wetlands that we're studying. The history of wetlands in Westchester County, not surprisingly, is one of very significant human interference, a lot of filling of marshes to make way for residential and recreational land. And some of the areas that we're going to look at are adjacent to Hommocks Conservation Area. There were a lot of wetland filling. Otter Creek is the same way, creating Harbor Island Park. And then Manursing Lake used to be all coastal wetlands, but a lot of this happened in the early 20th century. So here is an example of what the Hommocks Road area looked like, an aerial view in 1925 and 26, and you can see these channels being really indicative of salt marsh habitat throughout this area. And you've got a red star here, which is the site of a case study, which we'll be discussing later. But also because the aerial photographs aren't all aligned, that red star stays in the same place as we look at 1960. So going back to 1925, and you look up in this northern part of the, I think it's north, but let's just say the top of your screen here, and you can see the curling wetlands there, and you know, this has been basically replaced by a residential field. You do have still some wetlands over here to the right of your screen, but then if you go to present day, so there's a lot of a lot of wetland loss, a lot of recreation, and you know, dry land gained. So you know, there are costs and benefits to all of these things, of course. In 1924, you can actually, this is an interesting one, I think, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 1924, you can sort of see that this wetland is in the process of being filled. You've got the ballpark that's part. Anyway, I think I was saying is that I think we're catching this wetland in the act of being filled here in 1924, because if you go to 1940, it basically has become drylands that then became Harbor Island Parks. That gives you a sense of when this was all happening, early in the 20th century. And I don't have a current photograph of that, but here's another one that is very interesting, which is Manursing Lake area, where there really was a lot of wetlands. You can see here in the south of the Manursing Lake area and the north of the Manursing Lake area here. And I put a star on this little interesting nose-shaped island because it's not very easy to recognize how much, because so much has happened in that location. And so there's a lot of wetland loss there, obviously, in that process, but also a beautiful lake created. But marshes in particular provide a number of benefits. I just need to, let's see, I put down all my windows, so I'm going to see if I can figure out how to open those all up again, like the chat window. And I also wonder if this is, yep, it's recording. That's good, because I was recording. And the question and answer. So, and finally, thanks for sticking with me here, just to see if anybody was had raised their hand, but I don't see any of that yet. Okay, good. But feel free at any point if you want to raise your hand or ask a question in the chat or in the question and answer piece. We'd be happy to address those. But part of the reason that we you know, specifically care about the marshes as opposed to some of the other land types is just that it's a critical role for habitat, especially for birds, small fish, and game fish, which we're calling nekton here. Marshes also have other important benefits that are, I mean, there are indirect benefits of habitat to humans and direct benefit to the habitats, but there are more direct benefits to humans in terms of wave attenuation and erosion control, preventing the shoreline from changing rapidly under the case of storms or sea level rise, nutrient sequestration, and then this is, I guess, the indirect benefit that I was talking about, which is recreation and the character and the natural area proximity that marshes can bring. And a lot of research has found that marsh is particularly critical habitat for birds. It has a number of functions to the life cycle of birds, depending on the species. It can be used as a breeding or mating location and nesting grounds for certain species, especially the high marsh, as you can imagine. A refuge for predation, as more complex areas provide locations where they can escape from predators, as well as being an important rest stop along the Atlantic flyway. And what the research has shown is that high marsh habitat is especially important. This is that irregularly flooded marsh that I was talking about, is less salty, and salt marsh sparrows, which is a threatened species, relies on, particularly on the high marsh habitat. And there are you know, our research has found is that there are numerous endangered and threatened birds that use the Westchester marshes. So this is an example of, this is a list of the just some of the endangered and threatened birds that have been viewed in the Westchester County marshes, and we kind of prioritize them based on this species of greatest conservation need status, the Audubon status, and the New York state DEC status in terms of being endangered and threatened. And so these were all viewed at marshlands or known to have habitat in that location. And another piece that is really important in terms of marshes is habitat for the game fish. Again, the refuge from predation. And what nekton really means is a organism that is not just that can hold its place in water, it can swim and hold its location in water. So that can include game fish as well. But one paper that we looked at from Peterson and Turner just found that shorelines adjacent to marsh habitat are critical to various life history stages of ecologically and commercially important species. So again, that's sort of your ecological and your human benefit simultaneously. And so the marsh has a really essential role in the coastal food web. This figure that Kayla Sullivan put together, appreciate that. It gives a good illustration of that, where you have something like a salt marsh sparrow here, which is letter H, that actually relies on the marsh for habitat, but also relies on other organisms that rely on the marsh as a food source. And the marsh itself produces organic matter that serves as food for the base of the food web that goes through the invertebrates into the other organisms, into the game fish, into the osprey. So without the marsh, this ecological food web, it may not be viable, or it may cease to exist in that location. And there have been a number of studies, and it's a really interesting ongoing area of research is, as you can see, this paper as recent as 2021, showing that, I mean, I think conceptually people thought, well, marshes can be important in terms of wave attenuation, in terms of like absorbing the energy from the waves. Now there's more and more evidence coming in that it is actually effective, and that substantially mitigates infrastructure damage. And as well as the fact that when you have marshes present, like as opposed to, say, an unvegetated location, the marshes send their roots down in, and that significantly reduces erosion rates. Studies find that vegetated wetlands have much lower erosion rates. And another role that marshes can have is actually filtering nutrients out of wastewater or out of coastal waters. One of those is in terms of greenhouse gas. Blue carbon storage is a function that marshes provide, and this will prevent the release of carbon dioxide or methane. But they're also very efficient at removing nutrients from like nitrogen and phosphorus from, say, agricultural runoff or septic effluent, for example. And as well as this process of denitrification, where nitrate becomes nitrogen gas. And that in turn, if those nitrogens stay out of the water, then you end up having less algae that are growing in the water. And when the algae die back, you don't have oxygen. You don't have the system go anoxic or have low oxygen, which causes fish die off. So there's a number of, that's sort of an indirect but important benefit of marshes. And another, I think, really important way to sell this is just the character of Westchester County and recreation, and how people like to think of the land that they live in. And in the marshes that we've identified, there are a lot of really nice opportunities that I think well utilized in terms of wildlife viewing. Marshlands Conservancy has a network of trails. Otter Creek has a forested upland trail adjacent to the wetland, as well as a nesting platform. Hen Island, just as it's not open to the public, but there's constantly people boating around it, and osprey nests and the oak trees there. And then there in the Hommocks Conservation Area, there's also a trail. So these recreational areas already exist. And if you again, if you have any questions at this point, feel free to raise your hand or chat or type it into the question and answer. A sip of water and then I'll just charge on because we have a lot of interesting model results to look at in just a moment.
We just had a question or comments in the Q&A, which I just thanked Suzanne for. She just clarifying some ownership of the John Jay area that you pointed out earlier. So it's
okay,
good, helpful information for us.
Yes, good. And that's, thank you, Vicki, for bringing that up, because that's one of the things that I wanted to mention was that in terms of the public comment, one of the ways you can make public comment if you want to be very efficient is to go ahead and just put it in the chat. This will all be archived, and that'll be, that if you have something off the top of your head, feel free to pipe in right now. Even if it's just something that, you know, it's not like necessarily a question, but a comment in terms of how we can improve the document. Let's see, here's the document itself. So, so basically what I've been doing so far is kind of pretty linearly going through what is a fairly linear document. And a lot of the pictures here you'll see in the presentation, you'll see are already in the document and just a little bit more fleshed out. So as you can see, the next section here, we're going to talk about our threats. And there are indeed some pretty significant threats. We've talked about development, and I don't think that the type of actions that occurred in the 1920s, where wetlands are getting just filled with meters of sediment and developed, I don't believe that is likely to continue to happen due to current regulations. But now one of the potential issues is development that's adjacent to wetlands. We'll talk about water quality, marine debris, and sea level rise and the changing footprint. But one of the things that I think is really notable in terms of thinking about these threats is that if we talked a lot of, we know there was a lot of wetland loss in the 1920s, 1930s. But if you look at a report produced by Cameron Engineering in 2015, and you look at the trends from in more recent history, 1974 to 2005, they still found that over 1/3 of Westchester County tidal wetland area was lost. That's a pretty significant ongoing. So these threats are ongoing. And in particular, they discuss two of the marshes that we are studying in this project, Marshlands Conservancy and Blind-Brook Wetlands, and they both lost 25% in that interim. So as I was saying, one of the things that occurs is when you consider development, and you also consider that under the when you consider development, you also consider that under the lens of sea level rise, that's then potentially development that's actually adjacent to marshes becomes dangerous because you can see marsh might have the potential to migrate upland, but if there's a vertical seawall there, it's basically going to undergo something called coastal squeeze, where you basically lose that habitat. And so the question is why? Well, also why in 1974 to the present date did we lose 1/3 of Westchester marshes? And one of the theories about this, because sea level rise has been occurring, but not necessarily at a rapid enough pace that you would expect marsh losses, because marshes actually move vertically, both naturally just from the deposition of sediment as the water comes in and out on them, but they also so they move. They also have a certain amount of what is called elevation capital, so that they can withstand a certain amount of sea level rise. So models wouldn't necessarily suggest that based on the 3 millimeters or so of sea level rise that have been occurring from 1975 2005, we'd lose 2/3. So another possible hypothesis is our issues with water quality. And so there the Sound Health Explorer found that there are issues from nutrient loadings in Westchester County. Um, and so marshes can improve water quality, as I was saying. And I found some studies where they actually took and put some high nitrogen water on high marshes, and then saw what the filtration capability was of them, and it was very close to 100%. But I think the question is how many nutrients. People who are gardeners will recognize that you can over fertilize your plants and then the plants die. And I think that might be something that's going on, as well as the fact that there are other contaminants in there, like herbicides and things like that. The other issue is that sometimes marshes will put less of their energy into their roots if they're in a high nutrient situation, and that causes them to become more subject to erosion. Another sort of more direct and observable potential issue is just marine debris. Some recent studies, found that there are actual injuries to marsh grass, which isn't that surprising if you look at a picture like this and you recognize that, okay, yeah, light is not managing to get to those marshes, and those are not necessarily as viable. Another thing that a lot of environmental scientists are starting to try to understand, model, is this concept called microplastics. And this is the plastics that have been coming into the environment since the mid 20th century, are still there. They never completely disappear, but they break down into smaller fragments, which actually enter the food web, and through biomagnification can come up into the predator species in a higher quantity. And then within the predator species, there are a number of issues that can occur. A larger piece of plastic will just physically prevent ingestion of other types of food. Smaller types of plastic can break down in the body to daughter products that can be toxic. So there's a lot sort of looking at in terms of plastics and its impact on the environment. So all of these other threats are, as I said, also need to be taken in context of potential and likely sea level rise. And so this is where the NYSERDA project came into place, which sort of started all this. And we've got it's using this model called SLAM, which is a sea level affecting marshes model, which is a fairly simple landscape model, but at the same time has a lot of details built into it to try to be as accurate as possible and to take into account various types of uncertainties. So this is the interactive Marsh-Fate Viewer, as I said, we have a list of the link to the full set of GIS maps from that viewer. Let me go ahead over. Now I'm a little bit things got a little bit scrambled because I was trying to. Here we go. Okay, so this is the interactive Marsh-Fate Viewer, and as it's a what we did was we took some of these SLAM results, and with help from Vicki, we identified 20 of the largest contiguous marsh systems in coastal Long Island Sound and developed this viewer for all of those. And when you zoom in, Westchester County, because a lot of these marshes were initially pretty small, only got one into this top 20, which is the Marshlands Conservancy. If you zoom in on it, you can see it provides information about the ownership, which in the case of Marshlands Conservancy is a little bit simpler because it's largely publicly owned, the current marsh resources. But it provides a number of different of ways to look at this. You can look at probability maps. You can look at marsh type maps where, again, primarily we're looking at high and low marsh. And then you can look at different sea level rise scenarios, and you can roll through, sort of animate your way. Let me go in a little tighter on that. You can animate your way through what happens potentially here. And you can see this blue color becoming green, which is more salinity happening in the high marsh. And you can also see some holes opening up, some significant holes, but under the sort of the worst case scenario. Because again, what this is really looking at is these model results are exclusively looking at sea level rise. They're not looking at sea level rise combined with too many nutrients combined with large storms. This is sea level rise alone. And so it shows that these marshes kind of are close to, maybe kind of close to the edge without these other threats. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this viewer, but know that there are a lot of resources available that we can send to you. But also there is a comprehensive help file here, a lot of definitions here about what things mean on the viewer. If you click on the parcels, it actually gives you information about the predicted marsh fate on that parcel. And so it you can maybe look at different parcels comparatively and see. It could help you to define areas that you are interested in doing some work on. Now, the other thing I want to note is that the choice to do all of Westchester County came after we had selected these, and so we don't have the other 5 wetlands in the viewer. But it probably wouldn't, that may be a coming attraction, because once you've built once you have built the viewer itself, adding additional data to it's not particularly difficult, and we already have the model runs, so that makes that a fairly straightforward process. So hopefully that'll be coming. And Vicki, it looks like you're doing an excellent job answering all the questions. So I don't know if there's anything open that you want me to answer right now before I start going into some sea level rise scenarios.
No, Suzanne just keeps giving us some great information. So some local history and knowledge, so that's great.
Yeah.
Jeff just asked about Manursing Lake and the restoration there, if we knew about it.
Yeah, we do a minor highlight of that, at least one of the restorations there. I'm not sure we got all of it, but that's something where if somebody looks at the report and says, we could have some more information on this, and they have information to provide to us, we'd be happy to put that kind of information into the report. But I think I actually have a slide on it upcoming, if it's the right restoration. Okay. So let's start in the north again at Blind-Brook Wetlands. This is the aerial view of it. And this is how that aerial view looks with sort of a marsh mapping on it. And so what we're going to be looking at are these, primarily this like blue and green color here. This green color indicates that this has the potential to be a low marsh habitat. The purple color indicates flooded, that this area came in our database as a developed, having a percent impervious. So that could be a road or it could be a house, less likely to be a marsh habitat in the future. So this is our sort of the current condition looks like this. And as you move through, this would be sort of in 2055, so mid-century under a medium sea level rise scenario. You can see that there are some expansion of potential high marsh habitat. So that's kind of the way this should be looked at, is these areas are being flooded frequently enough that they could become marsh habitat. Certainly under restoration, they could become marsh habitat. But you go all the way to 2100 under that same medium scenario, which some scientists consider to be most likely. The story is different, particularly on the eastern side. It's a lot more flooded development, in marshes in people's yards and things like that. So this it becomes just a question: if this most likely scenario happens, what is the action that should be taking place? I mean, probably there's a lot of development there. So we know one possibility is to make sure the waters don't get in there and they don't flood. Under the worst case scenario, all the high marsh turns to low marsh, and you have even further sort of escaping of waters. This, I think, about 2 meters by 2100 is the high sea level rise under New York governor's office, and is probably considered to be the worst case scenario. So all of that sort of viewed on a probabilistic lens is another way that we have looked at this, because there's a lot of uncertainty in the model in terms of how much, what the different sea level rise scenarios will be, and also there's uncertainty within the model in terms of how the marsh will react to how quickly it will move in elevation, erosion rates, even the elevation data underlying is uncertain. So we vary all of that, and we run the model hundreds of times, and we end up with a map that says by the year 2100, these are the areas. So the red areas are highly likely to have the conditions for marsh habitat. And you can look at this over a public and private land lens. So the public lands here are clear and they are yellow outlined, and the private lands have these the dashes on them, and are a little, maybe they're a little cloudy, or maybe it's just the dashes, but they have the thin white outlines. And so you can see that there's some definitely some most of the current wetlands are publicly owned, but future private land flooding is possible, especially to the east of the study area, given the pressures of sea level rise. And we can take a look at these same maps for Marshlands Conservancy. And so this is under no sea level rise. This is current condition, basically, is what the NWI, how the NWI characterize it. A fair amount of low marsh habitat, and some high marsh habitat as well. And if we look at those same four scenarios, so 0.4 meters by 2055, some moderate expansion, but not a whole lot. If you go to about close to 1 meter of sea level rise, again, you start to see some holes opening up in the marsh and some conversion of high marsh to a more saline low marsh. And under the worst case scenario, you see big holes opening up in the marsh. Now, one of the interesting things about Marshlands Conservancy is all this area up here is publicly owned, but it also has a fairly decent amount of vertical relief. And so for the better and for worse, there's not a whole lot of marsh expansion predicted up towards the northwest of this study area. And this area, actually, this marsh actually has some of the largest conversion to open water on base of sea level rise alone. And that is because in its current condition, it's already low marsh, and it already has less what's called elevation capital. So it's already down around sea level. So sea level overtakes it a little more rapidly. But in terms of if you look at just sea level rise alone, it's really only the worst case scenario that you see a dramatic expansion. And this gray color here is an unvegetated mud flat. So that is a non-marsh. And this is what it looks like probabilistically again. So pretty good, pretty hopeful, I would say, in terms of Marshlands Conservancy over the next century. A lot of it is viable. These purple areas here suggest that under some of the moderate to highest sea level rise, that these areas have potential vulnerability. But if it's managed well, hopefully that can be a resource that holds on nicely. Looking at Otter Creek Preserve, the current condition now. This is privately owned, but it is owned by land trust. And so if you look at what happens under 0.4 meters of sea level rise, you start to get some expansion of marsh to the south. Under 1 meter, a bit more expansion, and then under 1.9 meters, so is again a pretty significant scenario. You definitely get a lot of expansion onto these private areas here. Also, just a complete change of the character of the marsh from a high marsh to a low marsh. So major ecological change going on there. So it looks positive in terms of the its viability, but there are some questions also when a marsh changes from a high marsh to a low marsh. It kind of depends on the substrate underneath it and the conditions at the time of the change, whether you have, sometimes you have these conditions of marsh collapse and it just goes directly to open water, depending on the substrate underneath it. I'm guessing there's enough inorganic substrate in this location that it would continue to be a viable marsh, but it definitely is rolling the dice. Hen Island starts with what the NWI classifies as a fair amount of high marsh habitat, which converts to more of a low marsh habitat under flooding. We're not really taking into account storms, which could be some area where you can certainly see that adjacent to Hen Island, there's a lot of potential for developed flooding under the worst case scenario, even under the moderate scenario. And then, and so Hommocks conservation area is an interesting one. Because there's a lot of, what you'll see is the model results suggest there's a lot of relatively low-lying adjacent land. So just going to 0.4 meters of sea level rise, there's a real significant horizontal expansion of, now, this is again suggesting that no actions are taken and no seawalls are occurring, and this is not necessarily predictive, but it just shows the potential of these lowlands that are adjacent. So under 1 meter, actually even these lands are so low that they no longer have marsh, but they have tidal flats. And then under 1.9 meters, a lot of these areas are open water, and you have a really significant, so really a different story than we got at Marshlands. Marshlands, the marsh stayed within its footprint for the most part. In this area, you can see that the footprint's tiny. Under the sea level rise scenarios, it becomes huge. And the probability map for that as well. And Pinebrook Wetlands, it again starts with a fairly small footprint. Under a medium sea level rise, you have a bit of expansion around the edges. Some lands here to the south get further flooded. Under sort of a most likely 2100 scenario, there's some further expansion of salinity, and then so there's definitely some areas. It's not quite the same degree of expansion that we saw at Hommocks, but there is some lateral expansion of the wetlands possible at that location. So because we looked at this sort of in a breadth rather than depth circumstance, there's a lot of sea level rise results to go through, but so I guess I can, Vicki, are there any questions you think that I should address at this time?
We just had a comment. Let's see here.
Thank you for monitoring those, by the way. It's really helpful to not come out of the presentation and then suddenly be like, whoa, what is all this reading?
There's a lot of information. Suzanne was just mentioning a location called Nursery Park in the Blind-Brook area, owned by the city of Rye, that's being considered for artificial turf. And there's some concerns from environmentalists about this choice because it's in a buffer area for some wetlands. So that's just one thing she commented on. And I think we had, oh, she also commented on the Department of State, the watershed plans, which we know about. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, then Rebecca had mentioned if we had reached out to the neighbors in the Hommocks area to see if they'd be willing to make changes to conserve the marshlands in the area on their personal property. So I had just mentioned that we have a case study that highlights that potential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Well, that's good, because that's a good segue into okay, we have this information. What can we do about it? And so we kind of created these categories that can be used in marsh conservation planning, taking into account some of this information. Well, obviously one important thing is managing current resources, and that is important, as we've discussed, even the current resources are under a number of stresses. Then, using model results, I think these results should probably be mostly considered, to a certain extent, screening model results, but they certainly help to show areas where land purchases or easements might have a significant effect on future marsh habitat. Obviously, local or state regulations a possibility. We'll talk a little bit about marsh restoration. I think more data gathering analysis is always important, although sometimes, I mean, I think sometimes that's the integration of the data, like was been doing in this project, is sometimes more important when you already have a lot of data than and the use of the data and figuring out how to get those data to the people who need them is more important than new data in some cases, unless you identify data gaps. And obviously education, the more people know about this, in many cases, the more they're interested in trying to solve some of these issues, or be amenable to the solutions that are suggested. So one of the pieces in terms of managing current resources is just that I think that marsh fate and the ecological fate is an important line of evidence or consideration in terms of managing water quality. And again, that obviously comes into the line of education, outreach, and regulation as well, because a lot of what local landowners do, that especially those that are adjacent, can have a big impact in terms of how much they're fertilizing their lawns, or the fertilizers that they choose can have a big impact on the water quality adjacent. And there's been a lot of work in terms of one issue is that in a lot of these marshes is the invasive common reed, which is a nutrient loving species, is pushing out a lot of native species, which is obviously problematic. And so there's been a lot of monitoring and monitoring and removal of invasives. Westchester Parks Foundation specifically goes out there with volunteers and hauls away acres of invasives in order to try to allow the native species to thrive. This is a really interesting case study at Marshlands Conservancy regarding the Phragmites, regarding the common reed. Because recognizing that it is nutrient loving, but also does poorly in high saline environments. So there was a patch of common reed and a ditch, a channel was constructed in order to both help nutrients depart from that location, but also to get salt water into that location. And then at the same time, there was some channel side plantings that occurred, and that case study seems to be a success. Monitoring stakes were put out after the construction, and that the findings were that the spread of common reed has slowed dramatically at that site. So that's one potential innovative way where you're not just carting away the invasives, but you're actually trying to make some beneficial changes. And I mean, as is somewhat clear, doing land purchase and easements is an option, but it's possible to, I think, we're hoping that these kind of model results can be something that is a consideration for prioritization. And there is another piece within that the viewer, where it actually looks at sort of an estimate of ecosystem services that are provided, integrated over the next, through the year 2100. So it actually kind of provides you a potential prioritization tool right there on the tool. But that's kind of complicated, and we covered that in our other. So if people are interested, I can send them some resources. And in many cases, doing something like an easement, where you just get buy-in for a property owner not to develop that portion of their property, or not to produce vertical seawall, might be much more affordable. And an interesting paper, fairly recent, here 2020, just found that there, in many cases, public and private ownerships were beneficial, because sometimes there are concerns from property owners about land takings or working with government, and sometimes the governments themselves, because of their own policy, legal restrictions, can't gain title effectively, as well as sometimes it costs more for governments than it might for a private agency, a private group to maintain properties or establish wetlands and do that kind of work. Sometimes that's more economical. And I think in terms of local regulation, there's a lot of resources that are available. One of the things that came up was the prioritization of marshes, and education about their specific habitat services and their enhancement of a town's unique character as part of a town comprehensive plan itself, which then can be something that zoning administrators can consider. But there are a number of state resources, and the New York State Department of State, in particular, has a this LWRP program, Local Waterfront Revitalization Program, which is kind of a structure to coordinate local and state actions, and provide state and federal consistency. So I guess in a way it's like having these kind of priorities of a town comprehensive plan, but even a little bit further, and there's more communication, state and federal communication between the town. And these LWRPs actually, they already exist in the town of Mamaroneck and the village of Mamaroneck as well. And a really nice resource that one of our stakeholders forwarded to me is this New York State Department of State, again, actually produced a document which has model local laws to increase resilience, and that's coastal resilience, I think. It's primarily what the focus of that is there, and there's a whole chapter in that. So there's more discussion of these in the report, as well as linkages to these resources. And marsh restoration is an important piece as well, but kind of the reverse of what we saw happening in the 20th century. I guess in terms of restoration, it's really finding former wetland locations to promote for current and future marsh habitation. But you can also consider that, marsh enhancement in terms of areas where sea level rise is likely to produce marshes in the future. It is a priority of state and local governments already, and Long Island Sound Study in particular, they have a target to restore over 500 additional acres of tidal wetlands as part of their comprehensive conservation and management plan. I've heard a bit about the restoration going on at Manursing Lake, but I don't have a lot of specifics. This is a beautiful picture from the Long Island Sound Study habitat restoration and protection of a wet meadow, but it's considered a wet meadow demonstration project. There may be more than that, and so if people have resources that they want to feed me in terms of showing case studies of marsh restoration that have been successful, I'll be happy to incorporate those in the report. I think it would strengthen the report. And yeah, there are a couple of case studies already in the report. And as we were talking, as Vicky was saying, one of these is this concept of a living shoreline and replacing a vertical seawall with a more of a nature-based solution, which has ecological benefits, but also, as we saw, can potentially have benefits in terms of wave attenuation as well. And so this landowner actually producing a tidal terrace, which has several multi-level and has different habitats, low marsh habitats, high marsh habitats. I believe there's also a unvegetated piece as well. So it is a very, so some of the landowners are already working on it. It's really interesting because actually, if you look at this, this red star is the location of where this conversion to a living shoreline, a more of a naturalized seawall is occurring. And if you look at 1925 and 26, this is the only place where the shoreline had been hardened. So this was the initial, the original, the old school seawall in this location. And obviously it persists through the 100 years as we look through these other pieces, and the other seawalls and the other shoreline hardening occurs. But a lot of this is occurring on this property to the north side of this channel here. So that's an interesting case study as well. And hopefully provides some information that if it gets out to other landowners, they might consider doing that. So thank you all for hanging in there so far. I think this might be the last slide. But do want to talk a little bit about the time frame. This project did get a little bit delayed due to COVID, like everything else in life. And we were actually hoping to be talking to people in person and doing a bunch of travel, which obviously hasn't been happening either. But the public comment on this document, and any edits or you'd like to suggest or advice or anything you'd like to have us incorporate or respond to, we're going to need that by the end of this month, as I said earlier, because the whole project will be wrapping up a month after that. So I'm assuming that'll give us plenty of calendar time to take into account those and release the final version of the document. Yeah, now the other thing is, if you want to raise your hand, in the last webinar that we had several people speak up, and it's interesting to have a conversation. So if there's something you want to say that you don't just want to type and have us read out loud, feel free to raise your hand and I will enable you to talk. Otherwise, I don't know if Vicky, if there's anything else that's pressing in terms of the chat or the question and answer that I should address.
There's just lots of great information in the Q&A that we can pull from.
That's great.
No questions in the chat to answer.
Well, the only other thing to point out is I'll just go back to the viewer really quickly, and then I will let you all free, which I'm sure well, let's say it's clearing here in Vermont, but I can't speak for what's happening in Westchester County or wherever you're located. But as part of this this viewer system, when you click into a parcel, you have some information about the number of acres on that parcel of marsh that are predicted under the current condition, 2025 and 2100. And when we talk about 2055 and 2100, those are the probabilistic results. So this is what's called sort of an expected value, looking at the uncertainty across all the sea level rise scenarios and all the other model inputs and the like. So in this case, you can see that you're expected to have another loss of about 1/4 based on sea level rise alone. But in terms of undeveloped areas, you potentially have about half that much habitat as again. So the total marsh expected value in this parcel particularly only drops by 5. That is assuming that you allow for that expansion to occur.
We do have a question.
Okay.
From Suzanne. She wants to know, can you please recap in priority order which of the marsh areas are most threatened?
Well, that's a good question. And I will jump to that in just a second. The only last thing I'll say about this before I go into the marsh. So there is also a fact sheet associated with each of the marshes here, and it provides some information about the losses, the potential for marsh migration and the like. So let me go into this. So I think that that's a good question. Which of the 6 marshes that we looked at, which are the most threatened? And I think that there's a number of lines of evidence to look at that. I mean, if we're talking about sea level rise alone, there is a summary here in the report on page 18 that talks about what is occurring in these different locations and summarizes the results from the back of it. But in terms of loss of existing marsh based on sea level rise alone, Marshlands Conservancy, because it has some of the most low marsh, even though it's not considered like a particularly vulnerable overall, it did have some of the highest conversion to open water, and it has really no area to move to. So there are threats at Marshland Conservancy, but I would say we really saw those under the highest sea level rise scenario. So long as, you know, if the other threats such as water quality and the like can be managed there, yeah, I think that's a hopeful result. I would say when we look at the land that you know, the land adjacent, that there are going to be some real significant questions at some of these marshes where the land adjacent is quite a bit lower. You know, will that strictly be a vertical seawall situation? I mean, I'm sure that land is extremely valuable. Or will there be some combination of vertical seawall and nature-based shoreline, and maybe even setting aside some habitat for future marshes in some of these locations, and particularly in Hommocks. So I think that there are going to be some questions about that. But the other line of evidence that I would look at is the history of loss at each of these marshes, because some of them have lost higher percentages and some of them lost lower percentages if you look at the recent history, which is another line of evidence for threat. And so I think part of the reason I'm having trouble just answering that with a straight up like A, B, C, D, E, let's rank these, is because there are a number of different threats operating simultaneously. But I think actually it's an interesting question. And if you define that question as like in terms of the existing marsh footprint, which are the most vulnerable to sea level rise, I think that, you know, I could go back through and answer that question. And so I would specifically make that, if that's something you'd be interested to see, I would specifically make that comment, and then we can address that in the next version of the report, because that is something that the model results can tell us. I just don't know that we've specifically, you know, looked at that metric in particular. Well, I think that's all for now that I have. So unless there are any additional questions. So what we'll end up doing is anybody who registered for this, we will be sending just a reminder to comment and a link to the document, and please feel free. And we'll also be sending a recording of this presentation if people are interested in watching it. And somehow none of my recordings have ever gone viral, though. I've never had, you know, 3 million, 10 million viewers yet, but so we'll send that recording, and feel free to forward that on to anybody who might be interested in commenting, or who didn't have a chance to see this, who might be interested. It's all dissemination is good, and then we'll hear from you, and we'll reach out again when the final document is complete, towards the middle of the end of next month of May. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know it's a challenge.
Yeah, thank you everybody for all the helpful information too that you provided in the Q&A.
Until next time.